Thus far, we've only used the bind method to configure event handlers for single instances of widgets. In this video, I'm going to teach you about how widgets react if they're bound to multiple similar events, and how you can create a single event binding which is tied to multiple widgets within the program. I'll start by accessing the exercise files in the Chapter 7 directory and creating a copy of that template Python file. I'll rename that copy to 05_multiple, and then right-click on it and choose Edit with Idle. To demonstrate multiple event bindings, I'm going to start by creating two label widgets. Label 1, which is a child of the root and has the text label 1 on it. And then I'll just copy that line and create a similar label 2. And of course, I also need to add those to the window, and I'll do so with the pat command. Now, let's add an event binding to label 1 that'll print a message when it's clicked on. I can do that by typing label1.bind. I'll use the mouse event of button press, which is triggered when any mouse button is pressed. And I'll do that, and I'll execute a lambda function, which will print the message that button press occurred for a label. So I'll say button press label. Now, if I save and execute this code, you'll see that if I click on label 1, it executes the button press label function. But if I click on label 2, nothing happens. And that's because I used the bind command on label 1. Now, let's add another bind to label 1, but this time let's make it for something a little bit more specific. We'll say label1.bind, and instead of just binding to any type of button press, I'm going to make this bind specific to just the leftmost button, which is button 1 on the mouse. We'll do a similar lambda function here to print out that this time button 1 was pressed and it was on a label. Now, if I save and execute this, if I left-click on the label 1, it executes the one label function because I'm using button number 1 on the mouse. But if I right-click on the label, now it executes the button press label function because it's triggering a generic button press. When multiple similar events are bound to a single instance of the widget, TK does its best to pick the binding that most closely matches the action that occurred. So left-click is more specific than right-click. If we wanted to configure that left mouse click event to both labels, we could bind it to the master window instead of just binding it to the label 1. Binding an event to a top-level window will propagate that binding to all of its child widgets. In this case, I'll call root.bind, pass in the string to trigger on the left button mouse click, which is button number 1. And again, we'll do a lambda function, and we'll print out that button 1 was pressed and was pressed on the root instead of on a label. Now, if I save and run this, you notice that if I click on label 2 with my left mouse button, it's triggering the one root function. But if I click on label 1, it actually triggered 2 events. One of those events is triggered for the label, and the other is triggered for the master. And this is important to keep in mind when building large applications where you may have multiple layered event bindings. Now, if we find ourselves in this situation, we can remove a previously configured event binding by using the unbind method. I'm going to remove those bindings from my label 1 by calling label1.unbind and pass in the binding that I had configured. So I'll remove the left mouse button binding, and I'll also remove the general binding I'd created for that label with button press. Now, if I save and execute this, those bindings, order matters when you put brackets outside of quotes. Save and execute. And now if I click on either label, it'll execute the function that we bound with the root. This avoids the conflict we saw earlier when we used the bind method on both the root and the label to bind to the mouse click event. The final thing I want to show you is that if we have multiple top-level windows in our program, we can create an event binding that will apply to all of them by using the bind all method. So I could call root.bind all and then pass in my event binding. In this case, I'll bind to the escape key. And then I'll press lambda E, and we'll print out escape. And if I save and run this, if I had multiple windows in my program, no matter which window has scope, if I press the escape key, it'll execute that function.